All right, welcome back. So this is Central America. This is a supplemental lecture that goes between chapter 15 and chapter 16 in your All Ye Lands, so 8th grade Catholic history book. So there is not a Central America chapter in the book. We're just pulling out a little bit of time to bridge us from North America to South America as we're finishing up the book here. So again, this is 8th grade, All Ye Lands. That's not your book. You don't need to watch this lecture. And it'll be pretty quick. There's not a lot to this, and then we'll be ready to move on. So, your book is going to explain in the next chapter that Central America might be geographically part of North America, but culturally it belongs to South America. And that's a fair statement. I don't disagree. Remember, this is a history book, not a geography book. And it is true that the patterns of civilization in the Americas in general don't really align with our geographic borders about things like continents. However, I want to look at Central America separately, real quick. It's a good way to finish out this week before we try and jump into a whole new continent. And at the end, we'll talk about how the way Central America developed, based on who was exploring it and colonizing it, ties back to everything that you wrote for me last week about North America, why we call North America specifically the land of opportunity, and how you get this very different culture in places that are actually very close together. So for example, if you look at the map here before we go on, that's Florida. Okay, it's not that far to Venezuela in South America. Okay, I mean, I wouldn't want to swim, but it's really not that far, and yet it's so different. South America is so different. So here we go. And you know me, I love my maps, and there really aren't any maps of Central America in your book. So, okay, so this is a narrow review. This is really just Central America. Like Florida has disappeared. You can't see it anymore. Okay? You can see the individual countries a little bit better. And you can see at the very bottom, there's Colombia, the very bottom right corner. So that's South America. And Mexico, you see, is North America. So Guatemala, Belize, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama are the countries of Central America. Okay, this is called a political map because it has the borders of countries on it and the names of countries, which if you were flying over, there wouldn't be lines on the dirt, right? But it's also a topographical map. So a topographical map is a map that shows you elevation, which means height. How tall is the stuff? Or how high, how many feet, how many meters, how high above sea level does the the dry land reach? So the darkest colors are the highest points. So, for example, if you had a question on this, which country in Central America has mountains, that would be Guatemala, right? That's where the mountains are. The darkest color is the mountains. And also, yes, in Costa Rica too. Okay? So, Central America is considered its own separate region. We'll talk about why. Geographically, it is the southernmost part of North America. It is called an isthmus. It is an isthmian part of the continent. That just means a narrow strip of land that is not a peninsula. Right? It doesn't just stick out into the ocean. It connects to larger bodies of land. There are 230 square miles of land in Central America. It seems quite small. It is quite small. Central America has the Pacific Ocean, the Caribbean Sea, and is called a biodiversity corridor. All right, we'll do that in the next slide. It's also called Mesoamerica. Meso is a prefix that means lower or partial or medium, depending on how you translate it. So Middle America. All right. Central America is also very active seismically. That means volcanoes and things like that. So the mountains that you see are the result of volcanic activity. If we were looking at a plate map that would show the edges of the plates of the Earth's crust, there would be a lot of plate intersections here, right in just this very small space. So, okay, so I said Mesoamerican Biodiversity Corridor, which is a bunch of unnecessarily long words to say super, super diverse, varied plants and animals. Okay, 7% of all the different things that grow on Earth can be found in this area. That means 7 out of every 100 types of plants, animals, insects can be found in this very small region. This is super cool. Why? Why are there so many? The biggest reason is something called the Pacific Flyway, which is the north-south path that migratory birds take when they leave cold areas and travel to warm areas at different times of the year. Okay, so it's not just the birds fly south for the winter, because birds from Antarctica, from the southern tip of Chile in Patagonia, also come to South America. So some of them fly north for the winter. Okay, so migratory birds travel through and across and into this pathway every year during fall and spring. And since the land kind of is a funnel shape, all of them pass through this area in a, this really small space. So that is very, very cool. The most southern of these countries on the map are the ones with the most creatures, and that has to do with they have more forest areas. It's just that tends to be where the animals live. So that's pretty neat. It's basically a rainforest. It's like you think of the Amazon, it's just a smaller space, smaller territory. So let's do history. This is a completely unreadable map, and that's fine. I don't want you to read it. I just want you to be able to see the colors. This is a map so we can get an idea of the Mayan civilization. Why the Mayans? Well, as far as we know, the Mayans were the first civilization to kind of emerge and develop into something complicated enough to build cities in Central America. You may have a book or you may have a website or something when you're doing research that talks about pre-Columbian American history. Pre-Columbian. That's just super fancy for before Columbus, as in Christopher Columbus. Okay. So the Maya were one of the pre-Columbian civilizations. And on this map, they're shown in green. So as long as you can see the green, you're good. Okay. I chose this one that wasn't just the Maya because the other civilization here, the one that's in orange or whatever you want to, yellow color. I don't know what color that is. Orange juice color. Anyway, that's the Aztecs. And I brought them up now because I want to make sure you guys understand the difference, okay? Obviously, location. The Maya and the Aztecs did not overlap in space. They were also a different government. The Aztecs were much closer to being a centrally run empire, whereas the Mayans, there was a king, but the different cities in the Mayan empire were pretty much independent. They were more like a city-state, and they all had a coalition than the Aztecs with their empire. So different religion, different culture, different language, and they also had a different interaction and relationship with the Spanish explorers. Okay, so they were the oldest. They had basically peaked before the Aztecs even showed up. The Aztecs kind of come down out of Mexico. But they're very important, and I'm showing them together on the map so you can get a sense for their size and all that stuff. It was not all smooth sailing with the Maya. There were wars, there was violence, there was death. They had issues with the Spanish. There were rebellions and revolts and sneak attacks at night and all that stuff you imagine. But again, I want to make sure that we're understanding, like the Mayans, are not the ones with the bloody, scary, awful, cutting out people's hearts while they're still beating human sacrifice in the Aztec culture. Okay, human sacrifice was actually forbidden by the Mayan religion, and it kind of crept in a little bit toward the end of their reign, and they got it from the Aztecs. Okay, they did have the largest of the Mayan temples. It's called the Chichen Itza, and they did have some human sacrifice if there was a national crisis, a disaster, a plague, a famine. They would, wasn't totally voluntary, but they would go seek out volunteers, right? To sacrifice, and they did that by drowning, and that's awful and terrible. But anyway, so lots of comparisons, lots of contrast between these two, and that's why I'm showing them to you on a map, even though they weren't ever really together quite like this. The artwork that we think of with the Mayans, if you guys, other than the Mayan calendar, you may remember, you guys are really little, but there was a Mayan calendar that said the world would end in 2012. And so it's a big, the world is ending. Obviously, it didn't happen. But anyway, what they're best known for is architecture. Okay, these still beautiful ruins of temples and pyramids in great cities. Some of these were still being lived in. They were active, functioning cities when the first European explorers came here. Some were already in ruins at the time, but they are all scattered all over the place throughout Central America, everywhere that the Mayan culture was. I shouldn't say throughout. Everywhere the Mayans were, they built these beautiful cities, and quite a popular tourist destination. And here's something that I did not realize until I was working on your stuff this week. The Mayan language, Mayan people, still exist. Okay, outside the cities in Guatemala, for example, the largest ethnic group, the largest population is Mayans, like full-blooded Mayan Indian people. In the cities, it's a mix, a lot more people who are Hispanic, who are from some kind of mixed heritage. And they still speak Mayan. There's at least 300,000 people in Guatemala who that is their language. They still speak the Mayan language. That's pretty cool. I did not know that. So back to history. A man named Rodrigo de Badistas was the first to establish a Spanish claim to this Central American area. He kind of sailed along the Atlantic coast around 1500 and was like, oh, there's dirt and it's ours, but I'm not stopping. And the next year, Christopher Columbus did a similar thing. It was his fourth voyage to the New World, and he kind of went along the coast from, on our map here, from left to right, from west to east, or from north to south, however you want to say it. Taking notes. He did stop. He talked to some people. He got a little gold. No settlement. More Spanish explorers come. They take some stuff, including slaves. They capture some Indians who they sell as slaves. And finally, in 1509, the King of Spain grants what's called a concession, which is like a license, to a man named Alonso de Olleta. And he says, okay, you can go settle South America. And instead, what happened? They suffered. Okay. Terrible losses, disease, shipwreck, hostile natives. Basically, the two guys who were given the license perish, and their plan falls apart. But a guy who survives all this destruction, who is literally a stowaway at first, survives and starts a little settlement called Santa Maria La Antigua, kind of at the far right of our map. You see Santa Maria. It's actually in Colombia now. It's in modern Colombia. And turns the survivors into this very productive little colony. And by 1510, he is going out and starting little settlements other places that are very much inside Panama and in Central America. So Vasco de Balboa is the guy who sort of founds Spanish Central America. So most of the conquesting was done by people like Balboa. They were Spanish soldiers. They were paid explorers, kind of professional adventurers. However, wherever the soldiers and the explorers went, missionaries went too. Sometimes it was right away, sometimes a little after. Sometimes the missionary was the explorer. That was actually very common more in North America, that it was the priests who were doing the mapping and the exploring. So, one of the exceptions to the rule, one of the missionaries who was also an explorer in Central America was a Dominican friar named Bartolome de las Casas. And he's known by many titles. He was a bishop. Was a reformer of Spanish practices in their colonies. And he had started life as one of those professional explorer, adventure kind of guys. He was sort of like a real estate developer. He would organize groups to come to Central America and settle. And they were almost never successful. This was not something that the Spanish were doing particularly well. When the Spanish were coming, we'll talk about this later at the end, the Spanish really weren't coming to settle and make a new life for religious freedom or anything like that. If they were coming, they were really just coming for the money. That was the whole point, and that's fine. But it didn't tend to produce very lasting settlements. But what it did tend to produce, again, were really bad incidents, really terrible run-ins between the Spanish and the Indians, and the Spanish tended to be very brutal. And this, after enough of these, witnessing these terrible events, Las Casas was just really disenchanted, and he left exploring and went to join a Dominican monastery. And he did that for several years, went to school. It takes a long time to be a Dominican. And he's like, you know what, I'm going to go back to South America and I'll be a missionary. He founded monasteries in Nicaragua and Guatemala. Then he left those places because he could not get the Spanish authorities to cooperate with his plans to treat the Indians better and things like that. And then he tried to found his own little province, his own little settlement in what is now northern Guatemala. And he called it Verapaz, which means true peace, right? It didn't really succeed as a settlement, but he kept very careful records of what he did and wrote several books criticizing the Spanish government for their treatment of the Indians and arguing about how it could be done better. So really, and sort of an interesting guy. All right. And so all of that was in the late 14 and in the 1500s. So by the mid 1600s, things have settled down a little bit. And what you get in Central America, and it's the same in South America, is all these little kingdoms. Okay, they're all basically Spain. They're Spanish colonies of some kind. But they're semi-independent. They're rulers. You can imagine like a prince or a duke, who's they call them kingdoms. And this guy, he calls the shots, but he's in charge because the king of Spain wants him to be in charge there, right? So this is how it looks, and their influence is going to spread into South America, pretty much everywhere except Brazil. Okay. So these connections that we just, again, very quickly just go over right here, these connections to the age of discovery, how this area was founded and explored and settled, these are the reasons that Central America is not in the North America chapter of your book, right? Because it doesn't fit. Because think about it. Who settled North America? Okay, the French, the Spanish, the English. So what happened that made North America English, but Central and South America Spanish? And then whatever happened to the French. I don't know what's going on with them. Well, okay, I know, but it doesn't fit here. So anyway, so we've got 2 continents, 3 groups of people. Why did the 2 continents end up so different? Okay. So one way the Spanish style of colonization has been described, it's not my thing, is gold, glory, and God. Okay. The Spanish were coming for riches, to expand their territory, and to spread the faith. Okay. None of those things require large numbers of settlers. As a matter of fact, bringing a whole bunch of civilians with you who take up space and food and everything else is the opposite of helpful for those goals, okay? Except maybe the missionary one, it's not helpful, okay? So the Spanish were traveling with soldiers and missionaries. They wanted riches, new trade routes. Obviously, the missionaries are converting or trying to convert the Indians, okay? The Spanish eventually were capturing and selling the Indians as slaves as well, okay? The Spanish did settle. They would build very large plantations where they were growing crops, but there were never very many European Spaniards, okay? I didn't take the time to get something like a demographic, but you know how many percentage-wise, 5%, 10%, was very few, okay? And the rest of the work was being done by the Indians there who were enslaved. Or sometimes the Spanish did have African slaves as well, but they were usually just enslaving the Indians. So the French were similar. They built a couple big cities in Canada and at New Orleans. Nolans. But mainly they were explorers and missionaries, the same thing. They became wealthy through trade. They were not bringing large numbers of civilians, of people who were going to settle and build farms and towns and things like that. So missionaries, fur trading, things like that. By contrast, do you remember those first 2 English groups of visitors to the New World were not professional explorers? As a matter of fact, they were almost the opposite. They were more or less just ordinary people who came to New England to start a new life. Yeah, sure, obviously they did fine. They were survivors, but they were not, you know, oh, let's explore a new river because that's how we get our thrills. No, they were coming there to live. So these are people who came, they had families, they invited their friends. They grew the English population in the New World in a way that the Spanish and French did not. Okay? And even now, South America, you still have a South American culture, which is very heavily influenced by the pre-Columbian, remember what that means, pre-Columbian cultures, and they happen to speak Spanish. Okay, South America is not as close a copy of Spain as the United States was of England. Okay, so that's the difference. That's why it's separate. That's where the difference in culture and everything else comes from. And then we're going to see geography has a lot to do with it in South America as well. Okay, but these are some of the reasons. And that's it. That's it for this video. I'm trying to keep them very short for you. Next week, we will tackle South America. And then we're done with the book. That's it for history for the year. Yay! We're going to write an essay together, but we're done. That's it with the book. So you made it. You did it. So I will see you next time. Don't forget to watch the sources on the next slide.